The news now on BBC One with Sophie, Raworth, Bill Turnbull and Emily Matlis.
At 6 o'clock, an urgent review, cot death convictions. After Angela Cannings is cleared of killing her babies, hundreds of other cases will be looked at. Face to face, now the Prime Minister takes on the public over tuition fees. Samantha Roberts, the widow of the British soldier killed in Iraq, has met the Defence Secretary, Jeff Hoon.
Tonight, all change on the tracks. The Transport Secretary, Alistair Darling, announces a fundamental review of Britain's railways. How bad behaviour on a school bus in Wales led to an accident and the death of a 12-year-old boy. And with the BAFTA nominations out, David Sillitoe is in Leicester Square for the opening of a late contender, Big Fish.
Tonight on BBC London News, no longer the thin blue line, but will 30,000 recruits crack the crime problem? And the school that ends at lunchtime, encouraging concentration or truancy.
Students from the poorest backgrounds will be given £1,200 when they start university to offset their tuition fees. It's the latest concession from the government to try to win the support of its own backbenchers in what will be a testing week for Tony Blair. He's told an invited audience on Newsnight that he's confident he'll survive. Here's our political editor, Andrew Marr.
By limousine to the lion's den. What does it take to get a Prime Minister into the same room as some of his angriest critics and Jeremy Paxman and a camera or two? It takes a knife-edge Commons vote. That's what. Remember Iraq? Yet again, Tony Blair decided to try to win the argument on tuition fees by confronting sceptics and critics.
We either ask you to make a contribution when you graduate,
it really infuriates me that you say, why should the dustman fund the doctor? When he has a heart attack, he'll be pleased that I went to university and graduated as a doctor, and therefore he should contribute towards the cost of my degree.
Yeah, but surely surely there should be a fair balance. He is contributing to the cost of your degree. I mean, 5/6 of the cost of any degree, even after our proposals come in, will be contributed by the general taxpayer.
But the biggest problem he's had with rebel Labour MPs is about buying and selling university courses. And MPs, it seems, aren't the only ones protesting.
That he is bringing a market into higher education where he's making students pay according to their bank balance and not their brains. Is that fair from a Labour government supposedly commits social justice?
Well, isn't it fair that you say that the student pays nothing on the way through, but that afterwards, according to their bank balance, as they do in relation to general taxation, they pay according to their means to pay?
Tony Blair calls these sessions his masochism strategy. But facing the most difficult week of his premiership, he seemed a man who's become almost impervious to bricks and jabs.
Are you entirely sure the end of next week you'll still be Prime Minister?
Well, I'm going to do my best, aren't I, to win the vote, and I can't tell you what the Hutton report is going to say.
And you're confident you're going to survive this?
I believe I will survive it, yes.
And that's what most of Westminster thinks too. But no one's absolutely sure, so it'll be a lot more fun to watch than to live through.
Well, from the voters to his own MPs, Tony Blair is now locked in talks with Labour backbenchers, fielding yet more questions on tuition fees. Well, Andrew Marr is in the Houses of Parliament right now. So what is the feeling? Will these latest concessions sway the doubters?
In logic, they shouldn't. In practice, they will help. These are not new concessions. This is something that Tony Blair has been wildly hand-waving, flagging up for some time to come. And yes, it does give students from the poorest backgrounds a bit more flexibility and a bit more money up front. But it's not the crucial new argument. It doesn't change the numbers dramatically. So what it does do, I think, is even if it doesn't give rebels who are wavering a new argument to use to switch over, it gives them an excuse. And that's what it's really all about. It's about a few people on the edge of the rebellion looking into the chasm in front of them saying, will I actually defeat the Prime Minister on his flagship? Deciding, I don't really want to do that. And this will be one last reason, excuse for them to go back to their supporters and their constituencies and say, sorry guys, I blinked, I've decided to support Tony Blair. The betting here is that will be just enough.
Andrew, thank you very much. And you can see more of the Prime Minister's debate on tuition fees in a special edition of Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman tonight on BBC Two at 10:30.
Within the past half hour, the widow of a British soldier killed in Iraq says she's been told by the Defence Secretary that lessons will be learned from her husband's death. Sergeant Stephen Roberts was shot dead trying to control a demonstration. He'd been ordered to hand over his body armour to another unit. Well, Richard Bilton has been following the day's events, and he joins us now live. Richard, was this another uncomfortable day for the Defence Secretary, Jeff Hoon?
It was, Bill. It was a very difficult meeting for both sides, and from the family's point of view, it ended pretty unsatisfactory. Samantha Roberts has just been talking behind me in a meeting. She seemed tired and fed up after what's been a very long day. She left this morning with her intentions clear. She wanted a detailed explanation from Jeff Hoon, and she wanted it face to face.
I think I need to just give him a chance to speak first, and then I'll speak to you after.
And how do you feel now?
Quite nervous.
A soldier's widow off to confront the Secretary of State for Defence. This is her husband, Sergeant Stephen Roberts. He was shot and killed after having to hand back his body armour. He had to do that because there was a shortage in his unit. In a series of audio diaries, he made it clear he was worried by the equipment he was taking to war.
Things that we're being told we're going to get, we're not. And it's disheartening because we know that we're going to have to go to war without the correct equipment.
So she arrived in determined mood and spent more than an hour with the Defence Secretary. But when the meeting broke up, she was not happy.
I think he should consider his position very seriously.
Why do you say that?
Because I feel that someone is directly responsible, and he felt he couldn't give me any answers as to who was responsible, and he has not directly accepted responsibility. He was very quick to tell us that enhanced combat body armour is not mandatory, which I find quite staggering.
There is to be another meeting between the family and the Defence Secretary when the investigation into Sergeant Roberts' death is complete, but there is still much ground between both sides. The Ministry of Defence haven't yet commented on today's meeting, but the Defence Secretary Jeff Hoon has apologised for the fact that Sergeant Roberts didn't have the body armour that he required, and of course there is an ongoing investigation into Sergeant Roberts' death. Bill.
Richard Bilton, thank you.
More than 2,000 families are suing the NHS for removing body parts from their dead children without their consent. They're to launch a multi-million-pound legal action against 137 hospital trusts. The Department of Health says the practice of removing organs without consent no longer happens.
No way to run a railway. A pretty damning verdict, you might think, on the current system, but that was precisely how it was described today by the man right at the top, the Transport Secretary, Alistair Darling. He admitted it was fragmented, complicated and dysfunctional, and said there could be a major rethink. Jenny Scott reports.
The 308 from Hampshire pulls into Waterloo. Looks simple enough, but running our railways is anything but. Control is splintered. There are the private companies that operate the actual trains. Then there's Network Rail, which looks after the tracks. The head of the Strategic Rail Authority is in charge of big new projects, and taking an overview of the whole railway system is the rail regulator. Confused? Well, even the government admitted today that the system desperately needs simplifying.
Simply, there are too many organisations, some with overlapping responsibilities, and it has become increasingly clear that this gets in the way of effective decision-making and frequently leads to unnecessary wrangling and disputes. That is no way to run a railway.
There was no magic answer today, but the government did hint it could end up taking more decisions itself. Passenger groups said it was a start.
More integration is needed because at the moment there's a bit too much competition between the different organisations. We're seeing too much waste. What we need to see is a focus on working together to deliver what passengers really want.
At Waterloo, they're proving that integration can work. 2 different companies are about to move into one office with one new boss. The railway tracks are run by one company, Network Rail, from that control room there. The actual trains are run by another private company from that control room. And now the 2 are being combined into one single control room over there. Partnerships like that are encouraging, but streamlining across the whole of the network is going to be a lot harder. Jenny Scott, BBC News.
And the time is 6:15.
A reminder of tonight's headlines. After the conviction was quashed of Angela Canning's, there's to be an urgent review of all criminal cases involving cot death over the past 10 years. And Tony Blair has said he's confident he'll survive the coming week of the Hutton report and a crucial vote on his tuition fees policy.
Later in the programme, how Cold Mountain became a hot favourite in the BAFTA Awards.
Later on BBC London News, the board game that imitates life in the ghetto and the company accused of profiteering. And
I just saw the woman I'm going to marry.
from across the pond, another big fish. Who'll be Ewan McGregor's latest catch?
Our electricity bills could go up by as much as 3% from next year, and it's all because of new rules which are supposed to tackle global warming. Power stations and heavy industry are going to have to pay for the carbon dioxide they release into the atmosphere, and those higher costs will probably be passed on to us, the consumers. For tonight's Six Special report, Fergus Walsh looks at how Britain's factories are going to have to start paying to pollute.
This is a carbon giant. Coal-fired power stations pollute the atmosphere with more carbon dioxide than anything else in Britain. This plant in Nottinghamshire faces a stark choice: either cut production or begin paying for its pollution. And that will mean higher electricity prices for us all.
When this power station's working flat out, that chimney pumps out 40,000 tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere every day. But the plant generates enough electricity to run 2 million homes. Now, by contrast, you'd need around 600 wind farms like this to supply the same number of homes. And of course, they're completely at the mercy of the elements as to whether they work at all.
So for now, despite the greenhouse gases it produces, we remain dependent on coal.
In the middle of winter, when the weather is extremely cold, then everybody in the country wants to be using their electricity. And we have just enough power stations to make sure that we can keep the lights on across the country.
From next year, plants like this will be given a limit on the amount of carbon dioxide they can emit. If they pump out more, they'll have to pay, so costs will rise. But if they pump out less, they can sell their carbon allowance to other companies across Europe.
I just wanted to let you know we've got a 1270 bid.
Enter the carbon traders. They'll buy and sell the right to pump out greenhouse gases. Every tonne of carbon could cost around £7.
For the first time, the ability to emit a pollutant, carbon dioxide, is no longer free. So you can't do it for nothing. There's a price put on it.
And paying that price will be 1,500 British firms, from steel, chemicals to cement works. All are bound by the carbon scheme. Many are unhappy because the British limits are much tougher than the rest of Europe.
If you go out in the market having to buy CO2, it's going to put the product cost up. And all that means we have to pass it on to the customer. It's very disappointing.
But what's bad for industry will be good for the environment. And in a country that was built on coal, we could finally see this dirty fuel consigned to history as firms are forced to move to greener, cleaner energy. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
There have been calls for tighter regulations covering school buses after the inquest into the death of a 12-year-old boy. Stuart Cunningham-Jones was killed when another pupil grabbed hold of the steering wheel and the bus driver lost control, crashing into a tree. Vera Davis reports.
Children fooling around on school buses, standing up or talking to the driver. Innocent enough perhaps, but exactly the kind of behaviour that can lead to this. A fatal crash in the Vale of Glamorgan in December 2002, which killed 12-year-old Stuart Cunningham-Jones. He was upstairs on a double-decker when it slammed into a tree after the driver was repeatedly distracted by schoolboys. One even grabbed the steering wheel. Giving evidence at the inquest into Stuart's death, Norman Davis broke down in tears as he described trying to stop one pupil playing with the controls. Every day, thousands of children travel to and from school on buses, either normal public services or buses run by the schools themselves. But there's an alarming gulf in regulations and safety standards, depending on the type of service and which school your child goes to. To show how many pupils you can legally carry on a bus, we squeezed 131 children under the age of 14 onto this 76-seat double-decker. Sat 3 pupils to 2 seats, without seatbelts and with no adult supervision other than a driver. Here in Neath, they were so alarmed by the lack of national regulations, they introduced their own scheme to keep the buses safe.
If they misbehave on the bus driver punches the card. It could be that it's something serious. 3 punches would be given, and then they would be off the bus for the month.
And after today's verdict of accidental death, there were calls for much tighter regulation.
Supervision is inadequate, seatbelts are not fitted, and management of the transportation of school children is uncoordinated.
As Stewart's parents were leaving court, the Welsh Assembly said they would investigate. Willow Davis, BBC News.
In Iraq, tens of thousands of Shia Muslims have marched through Baghdad to call for the right to vote for a new Iraqi government. The protest comes as the US Administrator in Iraq, Paul Bremer, is at the UN in New York. He wants the UN to back the American government, who believe that democratic elections won't be feasible before the end of June. Well, from Baghdad, Caroline Hawley reports.
A massive show of Shiite political power. They turned out in their tens of thousands. Their demand, one man, one vote. Shiite Muslims, the majority population, never had a voice under Saddam Hussein. Now they feel Paul Bremer's plan to transfer power gives the Americans too much control.
We want to express about our opinion. It's the democracy in Britain and Australia.
We've never had democracy before, this man says. Don't we deserve it? And here's the man who brought them onto the streets. Rare amateur pictures of the reclusive cleric who's rejected America's plans. Ayatollah Ali Sistani is Iraq's most influential religious leader. His foray into politics deeply unwelcome to the Americans. It's difficult to dismiss with the Shiites' demographic power.
This is precisely why Paul Bremer's in New York today. The Shiites are making their views abundantly clear. It's hard to ignore their demands when you say you're bringing democracy. So Paul Bremer's hoping the UN will back his position that elections for the moment aren't feasible.
And Paul Bremer also wants the UN back to help carry out his plan. Today, their headquarters still deserted after last summer's bombing, biggest tragedy in UN history. They won't return until they're sure they're safe. But today, more funerals, the victims of yesterday's bombing outside the coalition's headquarters. It doesn't help the American case. Caroline Hawley, BBC News, Baghdad.
In just over 6 hours' time, Democrats in the American state of Iowa will begin choosing their candidate to take on George Bush in the presidential election. The latest polls suggest there are 4 leading candidates running neck and neck.
Now, the American Civil War epic Cold Mountain is topping the nominations for this year's BAFTAs. Its 13 nominations include Best Actor for Jude Law. But the other big epic, Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, is hot on its heels with 12 nominations. Well, tonight, another competitor, Big Fish, premieres in London's Leicester Square, and David Silito is there. So was Cold Mountain a surprise then, David?
Not really, because there's one thing that awards ceremonies love. It's also the sort of film that Hollywood's rediscovered a love affair with making. It's the big, bold, old-fashioned epic.
Thank you, Michael.
It was soon clear at the nominations that this is a 2-horse race.
Cold Mountain, Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Cold Mountain, The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Cold Mountain.
It's about the first thing that I've ever done that might produce an actual result.
Cold Mountain is a film of an epic journey set in war-torn America, and Lord of the Rings is an epic journey set in war-torn Middle-earth.
This day, we fight!
And if scale and box office success are anything to go on, this should be a winner.
I mean, it's breathtaking. As a producer myself, I look at that film and I am awestruck.
But the epics don't have it all their own way. Big Fish, for instance, received 7 nominations.
When you make a film, you just hope that it connects to anybody on any level. So that's all that you really hope for. So it's nice when it does on some level.
But this year, size matters. Hollywood has got a taste for the epic.
so many rights have been sold to things like the Narnia books of C.S. Lewis and so on. You know, the epic trilogy is becoming a genre which is going to terrify us all. So, yes, epics seem to be the thing of the moment.
But while the big films have done well, some of the big stars haven't. This will be a red carpet without Nicole Kidman, Russell Crowe or Tom Cruise.
And while they may be disappointed, two other actors should be rather pleased with themselves. They've both got 2 nominations each. That's Sean Penn and Scarlett Johansson for her role in Girl with a Pearl Earring and also Lost in Translation.
David, thank you very much.
So will there be many cold mountains in Britain tonight? Darren Bett has the answer.
Not many, Bill. Just maybe the Grampians. For most of us, though, it's pretty mild, and for most of us, it's wet as well. Sunshine very much at a premium today, as it will be tomorrow. Hidden underneath all that cloud is the UK, and it's given most of us some rain today. Now, the wettest weather has been in the Highland region of Scotland. We've had a couple of inches of rain, over 50 millimetres of rain, and here there'll be more rain continuing through tonight and into tomorrow. So snow melt, significant runoff could well lead to some local flooding. The rain really grinds to a halt in the northwest of Scotland. You see how this weather front is bringing the rain. It just sort of tucks it in across parts of England and Wales, so that it just begins to dry off a bit across the east coast, and particularly the northeast of Scotland. Now, to the east of that weather front, we have some cold air. That's going to be very noticeable in the Northern Isles. We could have a touch of frost in Shetland, but that's really the exception to the norm. And for most of us, we're in the cloudy but mild air with temperatures around about 8 degrees or so. And there will be a lot of cloud around tomorrow. Not much sunshine. Still some rain around too, in similar sort of areas to those that we saw today. But gradually, after a dry start down the east coast and the northeast of Scotland, we'll just see that rain just edging its way a little further eastwards all the while, hopefully drying up a touch in western Scotland and allowing some brighter weather to develop across parts of Northern Ireland, southeastern parts of Wales and southwest England. For most of us, it's going to be pretty mild, but still a little bit chilly along that east coast. There you go.
Darren, thank you very much.
So here's a reminder of tonight's main news. As a result of Angela Canning's conviction being quashed, there is to be an urgent review of all criminal cases involving cot death over the past 10 years.
Tony Blair has said he's confident he'll survive the coming week of the Hutton report and a crucial vote on his tuition fees policy.
And Samantha Roberts, widow of the British soldier killed in Iraq, has met the Defence Secretary. He's told her lessons will be learned from her husband's death.
It's nearly 6:30. We'll have the latest on those stories just before 7.
Stay with us. So right now it's time to join the BBC's news teams across the United Kingdom.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.